So, good evening everyone. This is actually, so I do a lot of this speaking engagements. This is actually a first, doing a night event and after drinks. So we'll see how it goes. I've never done a presentation after a couple of years, so I'll try to do my best. I'll try to move around this thing works. So I work for National Grid. Probably many of you know who National Grid is, and I guess they cannot move that much. So I will need some assistance with the slides. So if you think about National Grid, probably many of you either work with us in any way, shape, or form, or you are one of our customers. So we're thankful for your contributions to our costs and for paying your bills on time. So that's always something that we like a lot. So I'm not going to get into this. If you go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about the team that I lead. And I always try to describe it as a startup within the utility. And the reality is, I mean, most of you deal with utilities on a regular basis, and you know that traditionally we're not necessarily fast-moving, we're not necessarily the most agile entities in the world, but there's a reason for that, right? The reason why this room is heated and this room is smart is because the folks that are in the field are making all of this work, right? And that creates a culture of risk reduction. Like, we don't like to take risks. It's a company that likes to follow protocols. It's a company that likes to do everything and verify it and verify it and verify it and verify it until they are 100% sure that it's going to work. The team that I lead, actually, it's the one that creates a lot of the problems with the utility, but it's also a team that also thinks about like what the utility will look like in the future. And a lot of people think that my team is just a bunch of R&D folks that just think about the next technology and what the technology will do. And the reality is, well, we do a lot of technology kind of exploration. We look at what are the new trends, what are the new things that are coming out. A lot of the work we do is not really around technology. A lot of the work we do is actually around business models. So at the end of the day, everything that we do and everything that ultimately gets to scale needs to have a good business model behind it. And what I mean by that is it has to be a buyer, it has to be a seller, and it has to be a way to make money, right? Otherwise, none of the programs that we run or any of the initiatives that we try to run will be successful. So that's what my team really does. It's really working with regulators, it's working with customers, it's working with technology partners to really get everyone together to say, well, how can we actually make this work? And there's a lot of test and run and see how it goes, and it is somewhat challenging when you're in an environment where people don't necessarily like when things fail. But that's the reason why they created my team. It's because the company recognizes that the 99% of folks that work for National Grid cannot be gambling whether the switch will operate. Cannot be gambling whether that kind of generation will actually come online at any given time. They want to make sure that it actually works. And while we do a lot of that work as well, we have kind of a little bit more freedom to try how different things will look like. So really our mission within National Grid is really thinking about what that model, what that utility future would look like. For whatever it's worth, I don't think anyone has to find what the utility future really means. We've tried many times. We've hired probably more consultants than anyone to try to figure that out. The reality is that it'll probably be similar to what it is today with some changes. It is a slow-moving industry, but we are seeing a lot of changes. And one of the things that I'll spend a little bit of time is telling you a little bit about some of the things we're seeing from a utility perspective, more specifically within my team, on some of the changes we're seeing. So I'll start on the customer side. We've seen big changes on what customers want from us, right? They want to be connected, they want to have more information, they want to have more reliability. They want to have all the services, right? Some want to have charging stations, some want to have solar panels, some want to have batteries in their home, some don't want to deal with us, just want to make sure that it works. But even for those customers, we still have opportunities to actually deliver more things, right? I'll give you a couple of statistics. We have 45% of our customers are looking to get anything that relates to smart home, whether it's a smart thermostat, whether it's a smart connected device, whether it's an integration system like Alexa or Google Home. And that's a lot. I mean, half of our customers are saying that they want to be more connected, they want to have more information, they want to be more engaged, right? And for us, as a utility, that's not something that we are used to. The other fact that we're seeing is more than half of our customers are interested in getting solar. We actually in Massachusetts last year had more solar interconnection requests than new gas services. It's the first time in our history where we've actually had more people asking for new connections for solar than actually more connections than gas. And that changes the way we actually make money. It actually changes the way we think about our business. Traditionally, we would have said, well, let's get as many customers into the gas system. It's a good thing. It's fine. And we have people say, well, now I want to be connected. Now I want to be a producer, whatever they're calling it, right? I want to sell you electricity. And we actually need to respond to all those things. Probably most of you have heard about New York Red. How many of you deal with New York in any way, shape, or form? Okay, some of you. So I'm sure if you're in New York, you've probably heard about REV, right? It's really looking to change the way utilities run, broadly. How we operate, how we plan our system, how do we engage with customers, how do we make money, and how do we integrate renewable resources into our grid. And that's something that, it's put a lot of pressure on us as a company, on everyone. I talk to a lot of companies, I talk to a lot of vendors, and the reality is everyone is still kind of trying to think about what the answer is, and they ask me, what do you think about the next thing is going to be? I'm like, I don't know. No one really knows. The reality is we need to start making some decisions and start to give ourselves some options to be ready for whatever that future is. And that's what we try to do. So I'll give you some of the things that we're seeing, at least in terms of trends, right? So decarbonization. So we talked about renewables. I would say in New England, steel penetration, it's not huge. We're not California by any means. But we're getting a lot of people now getting into solar. With net metering, you have either residential customers, even large commercial customers, wanting to have solar in their homes, or wanting to have solar in their roofs, or in their businesses, right? Definitely something like that. A lot of policies are driving us to get to a more decarbonized environment, right? Transportation is starting to play a big role. People saying, well, I want to have an EV. And the reality is, and I'll say something that's probably not scientific at all, the reality is a lot of the engineering products that we're seeing, especially on the consumer side, are starting to become really cool products that people buy not just because there are energy efficient or electric vehicles, they're just cool to have. How many of you wouldn't want to have a Tesla vehicle? I would love to have one. And probably, if I asked around, many of you don't want to have a Tesla just because it's an EV. You want to have a Tesla, which is a really nice car. Right? And it's the same thing with batteries. I don't know if any of you have seen the latest version of the Powerwall, but it looks pretty slick. And it's something you can brag about and show your friends, look, even if power is out, I still have power in my house. It's pretty cool. So there's a lot of people that, whether it's because of the environmental benefits, whether it's because of the economics, or whether it's just because of that cool factor, there's a lot of people that now are thinking about energy more than ever. To me, one of the best examples that I always use at conferences is Nest. Probably no one knew what a thermostat was 5 years ago. Now you have a thermostat company doing commercials on the Super Bowl. And a company was bought by $3.2 billion. It's quite a bit. It's a thermostat company. Probably the same company that has a thermostat that is over there on that wall. I'm sure that company was not valued $3.2 billion at some point. So the reality is they've discovered that customers can be engaged in energy as long as you make it sexy, as long as you make it cool, as long as you make it attractive and make it part of their lives. So all of you that work in energy, we tend to be really into the details. We tend to get into we need to make sure this thing works. And that's important. The reality is customers are also looking for other stuff. They're looking for that sexy factor. They're looking for that thing that is going to get them to show their homes and say, oh, by the way, I have this new cool gizmo in my house that makes them more efficient and makes me save money. And that means a lot for us. When we engage with customers, so I was part of the Smart Grid pilot program in Worcester, and when we gave customers the thermostats, they were like, what is this new smart thermostat? I don't know what that really is. And it's only been 2 years since we deployed them, and now we have people saying, oh, I want the newer one. It's becoming like a phone. Like people now think about changing the thermostats. In the past, no one would change their thermostats unless you actually change your home. Now it's different. So, so what does that mean for us, right? So we have to deal with all those expectations. We have a really obsolete system that we need to change. We have pressure from our regulators to make sure that we deliver safe, reliable power every single day. And when all those things come together, it's not an easy thing to do. And it's not an easy thing to do from a technology perspective. Technology always works. I always tell people, like, we have a project on a microgrid. I always tell people, I'm sure that if I give you enough time and enough money, you'll make the microgrid work. I bet that. And there's a lot of smart engineers out there that can get anything to work. The problem is, how do you pay for those things? How do you actually make it work? How do you get a customer to invest $1 million on a solar array that will then feed into a microgrid if you don't really have like the incentives, you don't have the net metering? If you take all those things away, will you still do it? And that's probably the biggest challenge we have when we think about the utility of the future. It's really how do you pay for all those things. So if you go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about how we're thinking about modernizing the grid. So the utility of the future, in my mind, has a lot of different angles. It has a regulatory angle, which is how do you modernize the regulatory structure. It has a technology component, and it has a customer engagement component. But in the back of all of that, it's actually that system that we use every single day. Right? We need to modernize the system, and for us, that's one of the most fundamental things that we're doing today. Whether it's in New York, whether it's in Rhode Island, or whether it's in Massachusetts, we have proceedings to really look to get us to the next level. And that chart kind of tries to show how we go about it. And the first thing is just catching up, in simple terms. When I tell people about friends of mine that are not in the utility space, and I tell them that we don't know when the power's out, they're always like, what? It's like, yeah, we don't know when your power's out. And as weird as that sounds, that's a reality for most utilities in the US. And for us, even when we think about smart meters, even when we think about some of the modernization efforts, we're just playing catch up. We're just trying to get up to speed with the current standards. We're not really getting to that utility of the future. We're just trying to get to it today. And I know it's tough because everyone's like, well, no, smart meters are really new and they're new things. Well, think about your phone. I mean, I'll give you one simple analogy to see how technology is changing and it's being disruptive for us. There's a company called Sense. Have any of you have heard about a company called Sense? Sure, a couple. So Sense is a small device that you put in your home. And it basically gives you real-time information on your usage. So it's actually better than a smart meter. It gives you real-time information on your usage. And not only it gives you real-time, it actually learns what your home is doing, and it starts telling you what you're actually using energy on. So I have 2 kids. Now I can see when they actually open the refrigerator door. And I call my wife, it's like, what are you guys doing? So it's creating some marital problems for sure. But the reality is, for us, and I'll give you, I mean honestly, when we did the Smart Grid program in Worcester, we never thought we could actually do anything like that. And we were using the latest technology. This company came along, and in a month, it learned everything that happens in my house. So it knows when I use the lights, it knows when my furnace comes on, it knows when the water heater comes on, it knows everything, right? So if you think about how the technology is changing, smart meter is already becoming obsolete. So even when we think about doing smart meters, the reality is we're somewhat already behind, even with the technology that we're thinking for the future, what we call the future. So having said all of that, I think that investment is still important, right? The fact that we don't have visibility into our feeders. But one of the challenges when I took this job, we said, well, analytics plays a big role in all of it, right? So if we find a way to learn what's happening in each of the feeders and we can start to optimize how we balance the load and all of those things, we can actually save money. We can actually help people to save money. And they're like, well, we'll only know what happens in 10, 20% of our feeders in real time. That's a big issue. And that's just thinking like you are a bank, and you only know what happens on 20% of your system. The other 80, you hope the money's there, but you're not really sure. So, and it's not a criticism, it's just a reality of where we are. So part of what we're trying to do is actually how do we start to understand what happens in the grid. And that has tremendous value. And for us, that's one of the things we're going to be pushing for across our 3 states. What comes with that, it's cybersecurity. And it's one of those things that, as I tell people, it's one of the things you want to make sure that it works. You don't want to talk about it, but you want to make sure that it actually works. I think there's been enough recent incidents in the US and in other parts where the grid has been involved in some major incidents. Up in Vermont, there were claims whether there was voter fraud or whatever you want to call it, right, through the utility. Target was hacked through their building management system, right? So as we get into this journey of modernizing the grid, getting the grid better, faster, more digital, more visibility, it also comes with some risks. And I think as a utility, we need to do a really good job trying to balance the security with the flexibility. And the reason why I say that is, so I'm part of a team that now is looking at cybersecurity for National Grid overall. And I had my first interview with the cyber folks. And they're like, well, we need to have this architecture, and this architecture is going to protect the company from anything. And I'm like, okay, sounds really good. So what happens the next time we do the next pilot and we bring a new device? Well, that's complicated because then it's like, we need to modify the architecture. It's like, well, that's not a good architecture. So you need to have flexibility to know that this business will continue to change. And we need to have a system that allows us to keep up with that change. At the same time, keeping everything secure. And I know it's a big ask, and I'm not a cybersecurity person, so I'm fine with asking those questions as a customer. But the reality is, cyber will continue to play a big role in all of these discussions. And it's not a sexy topic by any means, but it's an important one. I don't want to be the next utility on the newspaper that says, oh, by the way, they shut down the whole city of Worcester because they hacked into a device. It is scary, but at the same time, it's something that we need to pay attention. And the last thing is, and there's been a lot of debate on the DSP. Any of you know what DSP is and what it stands for?
I'm going to ask you that.
What's that?
I was going to ask you that.
There you go.
Distribution system platform.
Distributed system platform. Close enough. So if you think about, how it works in the transmission side, we have the ISO. So the ISO takes care of everything, right? The ISO balances the load, moves power from one side to the other, but it doesn't get to the distribution level. So ultimately, one of the things that we want to get to is having that same model at the distribution level, which means that then we need to operate and manage different loads and manage different resources at different times to optimize what we deliver for customers, but also to optimize how the grid operates. And I'll give you one example. We have a project up in Buffalo, which I think is the next slide. Can you go to the next slide? I don't remember, but no, it's not, so forget it. We have a project in Buffalo, which is really trying to demonstrate what a DSP is. And well, it's a challenging thing because you need to touch the control room, which no one likes to touch. You need to touch every single IT system to operate a bunch of different things. The biggest challenge of that project has not been the technology. Not even dealing with a control room has been as challenging as figuring out the economics, right? So everyone talks about net metering, and net metering is a solution. Well, the reality is, if you really think about trying to value distributed resources in the broad definition, so it could be a building management system, it could be a battery, it could be a fuel cell, it could be anything, it could be a genset, whatever it is. If you try to value that at the distribution level, it's a really complicated exercise at being able to find out. And the reality is, that's what is going to make that DSP really valuable. Because the whole concept behind it is, the whole principle is, it's cheaper to buy things locally, meaning buying the energy locally, than having to buy it from the bulk system. The reality is, when you do the math, the bulk system is still pretty darn affordable. It's pretty darn good. So it's only in certain circumstances where the actual value of the distribution asset, it's more than the value of getting it from the bulk system. So when you have a constrained system, when you have a kind of a pocket where you have peaky kind of feeder, then it makes sense. So all those economics, all that modeling, it's what's been really challenging for us as a utility, but also for the partners that we're working with. We're working with 3 other companies trying to figure this out, and it hasn't been easy. It hasn't been easy for a reason. That's why it hasn't been done before. But what I tell people and what I tell everyone every time that I go to a conference is when you think about technology, when you think about all these great ideas, that's absolutely great. Think about it from a business perspective. We're probably one of the few industries in the world where we always think about the technology first and then we think about how the hell we're going to pay for it. Which is fine. It's just the nature. We have a bunch of engineers. Engineers like geeky things, like the Sense device. We get excited about those things. The reality is, at the end of the day, someone has to pay for that. And when I meet with customers, I don't feel comfortable saying, yeah, you should buy this thing. We don't know if it actually works, but sure, give us the money to actually buy it. So the economics behind a lot of this, it's a big thing. So if you go to the next slide, this is an exercise we did with a few folks in my group. And I like to use it because I think it's a good reflection. We talk a lot of partnerships quite a bit in this industry. I usually have a title of Director of Partnerships. So I know a thing or two about partnerships. The reality is we don't do a lot of partnerships. And not just because we don't want to do partnerships, it's because the industry doesn't allow us to do partnerships. I can tell you as a utility, you have to go through an RFP process, which I'm sure all of you love, as vendors of the utility, and get 3 quotes and get the lowest bidder, whether that's the best option or not. So doing a partnership is something that's slightly different to this. But really, if you spend the time thinking about it, there's a lot of opportunities. And there's a lot of successful cases out there in the energy space where partnerships have been able to deliver more value to customers. And one of the reasons why I said this is the partnerships and the business models play a big role. And I'll give you some of the examples in that page. I remember, so my background is in supply chain. I did procurement for many years. And I remember when procurement, you would do procurement for travel, you would basically pay for a travel agency to manage your travel expenses. That's the way most companies do it. They have someone they pay for. And a lot of companies realize, like, I don't want to have that fixed expense. It doesn't make any sense for me. And then companies like Concur then brought technology and a business model. They cut the cost by 80%. And they can do exactly what each of you want, which is making your travel arrangements at home. Right? They didn't change the way people book travel. They didn't change travel. I mean, we all still go to the places for work. They basically just changed the way you do it. The same with Pandora and Spotify and the Apple Store. They didn't invent the music. They didn't change the way music is played. They basically changed the way those assets, that were actually the licenses, were used. And for us, as a utility, that's something that I keep pushing my team on. I keep telling them, it's like, what's the next Spotify for the utility? And there isn't a simple answer, because it's complicated. But the reality is, to me and for my team, this is the kind of thinking we should have. And I would encourage all of you, within your own world, to kind of have through some of these exercises. Because there's a lot of cases where we've seen some positive changes. There's a company called Utilidata. Anyone from Utilidata here? Good. I can say something about that. It's actually positive. So, Utilidata, it's a hardware company. They do volt management. So they basically try to optimize voltage on a feeder. Pretty technical. But the reality is they discovered that their product saves energy. So they can do it as energy efficiency. They can deploy their technology, saves money, saves customers money, because the reality is if you control the voltage, customers save money but without doing anything. But the thing that they realized is instead of basically selling all those assets to the utility, you can do it as a service. So you basically charge us by the kWh they save. So for us, especially in places like New York, where we can capitalize that, it's a different way for us to buy those services and not having to go through a painful process of owning some of those assets. So it's just an example of how even within a highly technical world and heavily asset world, you can still think about how this world could be different. Search price, and this is one that I love because I think I mean, everyone brags about Uber, for good or for bad. I mean, everyone talks about Uber. I think they definitely have to change the way the taxi industry works. And if you think about what they do with the surcharges, it's actually a time of use rate. That's what it is. They just actually sell it in a much better way, because they tell you that during peak times, when you want to get a car, you actually have to pay people more. It's a simple concept. And for the most part, people are like, oh yeah, sure, when it's pouring rain and it's 3 in the afternoon and I'm in Boston and I want to get to my house, whether it's 2x, 3x, I don't care. I need to get out of it. So I'm willing to pay for it. And that's the same thing we do with time of use rate. It's just as an industry, we try to explain it, we try to get into details, and we try to get every single customer to understand every single detail that we know. And the reality is, most of us, and I actually use my wife as a guinea pig for all the things we do at National Grid, I always show her, like, even the brochures that we do. Does it make sense to you? She's like, no, what are you guys trying to do? Like, I get that when it's hot, you can probably charge me more, but why do you have to explain all of this? And I think as an industry, like, one of the things we're learning, and we're trying, this is an evolution, and this is part of where my team can help to push. Changing the way you tell the story, changing the way you engage with your customers makes a big difference. And that's, when we think about that utility of the future, to me the utility of the future has many ways. And just simplifying the message and actually engaging the customers in a different way, it's part of that utility of the future. So it's not just the fancy gadgets that enable us to do a bunch of things. It's things like that that enable us to do things and optimize the grid for everyone and make it better for everyone and lower the cost, but do it in a way that is actually meaningful and helpful for customers. So, if you go to the next slide, which will be a little surprise for me, I want to cover 3 things. I did have a slide on the DSP. I thought about it. So I'll cover 3 things here. So I talked about the DSP, but there's topics that I get questions all the time. What does it mean for solar? What does it mean for EVs and storage? 3 topics that everyone that is in the utility of the future thinks about and asks about, and what does it mean, and how is it going to look, and how much will it be? Like, I don't know the answers. Like, there's enough studies out there that are trying to forecast what each of those things will mean. The reality is, I think all of those things will happen. Storage will happen in one way, shape, or form. We're starting to see it. Massachusetts is really active on it. New York will be definitely really active. And Rhode Island is starting to take steps up towards storage. Solar is the same thing. So if you go to the next slide, this is just an overview of the DSP. So this is the actual project that I was talking about, everyone. And it's really trying to replicate that ISO concept at the distribution level. And any of you that would like to hear more about this project, it is really interesting because it's the first time that the utilities are starting to play this role of being the aggregator, being the coordinator, being the economic engine behind a lot of these transactions. So we're in the early phases. We've done the pricing modeling and what this would look like. Now we're actually getting into building it and demonstrating what it really means. Like, actually trying to test it out and see if customers actually will jump on this. And to me, that's what it's going to make or break this model. We are working with customers, which is important. So we're not trying just to figure out this in a box. We're working with customers, but it is an opportunity for the utilities to think about a new role where we could actually make money in different ways. We don't make any money here. But in this demo, part of what we're proposing to do is, could we make money differently? So if you go to the next one, which I think is on EVs. EVs is one of those sectors that I find it fascinating. I mean, we've seen how customers start to engage in different ways once they have an EV. And for us as a utility, initially the reaction was like, wow, now think about all that load that will come in every place. Like, we don't know where it will be because we don't know where an EV will show up. And the immediate reaction was a negative reaction. The reality is, this is a way to sell more kWh, and while we don't make any money on the commodity itself, you can actually lower the cost for everyone because you're selling and optimizing, you're selling more commodity to everyone. So just by definition, if you're selling more kWh, the cost per kWh will go down. So EVs actually are a really good thing for everyone. So for us as a utility, we think we have a big role to play. So right now there's this chicken and the egg conversation between manufacturers, states, and charge station manufacturers where they're like, well, we need to have enough cars in the field so we can actually put more stations. Or we need to have more stations so people can get over their rings of anxiety and they can actually buy an EV. The reality is, I think for us, the utility, we think this will be a pretty big and important business. We're definitely going to be heavily engaged through partnerships. We're not going to do it all. We're going to be working with a bunch of companies. And really, the way we think it is three ways. We need to play a role in educating people. And I love the word educating because I feel condescending. You feel like we know it all and then people don't know anything, we need to tell them. So I actually feel like it's more giving them the opportunity, making the information available for customers in more places. Doing targeted expansion. I mean, there's some places where the utility is uniquely positioned to deploy this kind of infrastructure. For example, condominiums. We get a lot of customers that say, well, if you're a residential home, single family owner, it's easy. You can just buy your own charging station. You probably have enough money to do so. You can put it in your home. If you live in a condo, you don't have that control. So you need to convince 99% of your co-residents to invest in this technology. The utility could actually make that investment up front and actually facilitate that process. So that's one of those places where we think the utility has a role to play, and we think we can benefit everyone. Workplace. We have in our office a couple of blocks from here, we have a bunch of charging stations. People are there for 8 hours. It's a good place to do it. But unless you give the incentives to employers, things don't happen. And then the other piece is, we're also thinking about what would that really mean for us, right? So they're going to become moving batteries, right? So everyone talks about demand response and we think about it in the most traditional way, but this will become the next demand response, right? This will become the next thing that if you're a car and you're charged, and we tell you, by the way, if you give you $50, would you not charge your car? Or will you let us use your battery? That for us actually has a lot of value. So we're going right now thinking about what those economics would look like, and actually starting to demonstrate whether you can do that vehicle to grid interaction. So those are some of the things that for us in the future, we definitely see EVs playing a big role. So if you're in the energy efficiency world, I would encourage you to think more broadly than just energy efficiency and think about things like this. If you go to the next slide, around solar. Solar is another of those places where traditional solar developers, and I don't know if is there any solar developers here? I'm glad to good. I'm glad they take the forks and the knives away, so I'm safe here. The reality is a lot of solar developers would say, well, utility shouldn't own anything in the solar space. To some degree, I agree to a point, right? There are places where the utility has the scale, has the experience owning assets, and we can actually deliver more value to customers. I'll give you one example. In Buffalo, New York, low-income customers that have never had access to solar just because they don't have the money to do so, but they can still benefit from actually having solar. So we have a project where the utility owns the solar panels in low-income customers' roofs. We give some of those credits back to those customers, and then we use the proceeds, the remaining proceeds, to pay for the cost of the solar. So it's a good economic model to help those communities that they don't have the credit scores that you need to actually get solar on the residential side. And it's a good way for us then to consolidate all those solar assets and operate them as needed during specific times. So in that project, during constrained situations, we can play with the inverters and basically manage the power that we have in that feeder. So when you start to stack all those benefits, it's actually, there are specific cases where we think the utility has a role to play. We definitely see that there'll be more solar, there's no doubt about that. The reality is hopefully we can start to put solar in places where it makes sense, and it makes sense for everyone. Right now what we're seeing is we're developers, and it might not be the case for everyone, developers are putting solar wherever they can put it, right? And I think part of it is we need to think about what's the value of a solar system in a given place. That's part of what we're trying to figure out. Because I think everyone would agree that solar doesn't have the same value everywhere in the grid. And the last piece is storage. And to me, storage is, you go to the next slide. And to me, storage is probably one of those things that I feel could definitely be one of the biggest game changers. We've definitely seen the cost drop. I mean, if you see that chart, that's from the DOER chart of the state of the charts report. And by 2020, which is in a couple of years, pretty much the cost would be half. And if you think about what that means is, I mean, batteries will become more prevalent, both on the customer side, but also on the grid side. And those devices can really help us to manage how the grid operates in multiple ways. Granted, it's still new, right? So battery storage is still new. I mean, if, across the US, I think there's only 600 megawatts of storage installed. So we still have a long way to go. But the reality is, as a utility, we think that storage will play a major role in how we plan our grid. I'll give you a couple of examples. Nantucket, huge capacity constraint. It's an island, so the only option is you build a third cable. Storage is a good place to put it, right? You can actually help that island lower the cost, still get reliability, but without making a massive capital investment. Places where we have customers that have a unique usage pattern only for certain days of the year, we could use batteries to actually help them to offset some of those demand charges. The reality is, what we're seeing in storage is, we still have not been able to see a lot of places where storage pencils out economically. If you see the chart on the right, the only way we've been able to make storage work in the places where we're deploying it is when you stack all those benefits, whether it's capital deferment, demand charges, integration with ferment renewables, because it's the only way we actually have been able to make the economics work. Granted, that will change in a few years, but the reality is right now where we are, storage it's not necessarily financially feasible, but we need to start to understand. So if you go to the next slide, we have a lot of projects that we are already either in the works, or implementing, or have implemented, where we're really looking to think about from an operational perspective, what does that mean for us, right? So from a safety perspective, I had a conversation with our operations folks, and they were saying, well, you guys are putting all those batteries in. How do I know that someone is not going to get electrocuted next time we do repair a wire when there's a battery in that feeder? That's a good question, right? And part of the reason why my team exists is we can actually test and demonstrate what that really means for us. And that's really important. And I know a lot of people hate that utilities do this kind of pilots. The reality is we also want to make sure that when we deliver pilots and we use this kind of technology, we're doing it in a safe manner for our employees and for our customers. So that's at a high level some of the things we're talking about. I'm going to stop talking because I think after a long day of work, drinks, and a dinner, it's probably hard to keep you guys awake and hear me talk about this. So welcome questions on anything except for technical questions. So any technical questions, I'll divert to Dinesh. So
I'm just curious, is there what's the one thing DOER could do right now to make your job a lot easier or more interesting?
DOER is doing a lot of good things. I think what they're doing on storage.
DOER.
DOER, yeah. So DOER is doing a lot of things, right? So this proceeding they have on storage, it's one of those things that I feel will definitely help us. It will help the customers. Ultimately, it's not just National Grid. Storage is one. I think EVs, anything around EVs will definitely be helpful for us. And the reality is, I think the more we can work together, one of the things that I like about this proceeding on storage is that it's been an open proceeding for everyone to provide comments. And ultimately, hopefully we'll come up with something that is the best for everyone, not just for us, not just for a sub-segment of the industry, but for everyone. And that to me is probably where I think whether it's DOER or anyone else, balancing those needs is where it makes my life easier. And then the other piece I would say is thinking about not only about assets itself. So one of the things I've said on the storage side is it's not just about the boxes. The boxes will be important in making sure we set target and we set the economics, but also thinking more broadly about how do you then bring all those things together, right? We cannot just talk about storage and don't talk about modernizing and investing in systems to operate storage. That's useless, right? Going back to that slide about stacking values, if you don't have those systems allowing you to integrate different things, yeah, you'll get some benefits, but not all the benefits you get.
Do you know if the national grid is involved in any kind of storage beside chemical storage or batteries?
Yeah, so I'm going to get dangerously outside of my level of expertise. So the only ones that I know of, we're doing lithium in one of the projects, which is the Shirley one. And then the one in Worcester, it's a fluid-based battery, which is with bionics, which is the other technology that we're facing. Right now, we're not doing anything outside of those two technologies. But the reality is, as we get more opportunities to test storage, we're going to be looking at other things. One of the things we said in Massachusetts as part of the DOER request was, one, we want to keep it open to any technology. Two, we also want to have flexibility in what the targets look like. One of the things we said is we should have an N megawatt and a megawatt hour target, because you don't want to box ourselves so early in the process where you don't know if you need to have a unit that has a ton of megawatt hours or a unit that has a ton of capacity but not a lot of megawatt hours. So we're really open to anything that we think will actually work, but right now we're not testing anything except for those two technologies.
How great do you think, or does Grid think, the impact of electric vehicles is going to be on peak demand? There's been a huge emphasis on demand management and slowing demand growth. Can you talk about where electric vehicles fit in that peak?
Yeah, so it's a good question. We've seen many reports on EV penetration, and they're all over the place. Like right now, when we think about EVs, there isn't one that really it's even close to the next one. Having said that, I think there's a lot of value in kind of when you can implement TOU rates for EVs, because what that does is it brings the load, but usually it brings the load on an off-peak basis. So for example, it drives people to charge overnight, which is when you actually want to sell those kWh outside of your peak. If you only kind of have the EVs and you don't have that broader framework around rates and incentives for people to do that, you probably can get into, in some pockets, you can probably start to have some issues. What I would expect is a lot of those pockets would be in places where you have a lot of concentration for building office buildings like this area, right? So where you'll have a lot of office work charging, workplace charging. And in those places, I think the more you work with the customers to give them the incentives, the better you can plan and say, well, not only am I adding load throughout the day, but at the same time, I know that that's load that probably between 4 or 2 and 4, I can probably still rely on, right? Because those batteries, most likely not everyone will leave work at 2, right? So while you're adding load in some of those pockets, you also are concentrating a bunch of batteries that you can use during those times. So I think we're less concerned about the peak, as long as you do it in a way where you have a framework that comes with the incentives, that coordination, and the tariffs.
What are the technological hurdles to batteries on cars both-way traffic? Is it just this charging station? I mean, it should be analogous to power.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things, and again, getting extremely dangerous outside of my knowledge area. One is obviously the car itself, so some of the controls that some of the cars have. The second one is the charging station, so not all charging stations can do it. And then the second thing is the same thing around the same issues you would have with battery, right? So when you do a battery installation, right now there's certain protocols that you put in place. Right now when you do a charging station, you don't think about it the same way, right? So a lot of the things that we need to evolve to is setting new standards, right? So a lot of what my team eventually should be doing is setting new standards. For example, when you do charging stations, make sure to not only think about them from the use for today, but also think about what that standard should be for the future, which might be that then we draw power back to those batteries every single day.
Continuing on the EV thing, town of Winchester is putting one in.
That's right there.
But they decided not to charge for the electricity because the transaction charge is greater than the cost of the electricity that the car picks up in the 2-hour parking lot. You know, because they're putting it on the street. So, have you even thought about how you're going to bill a, let's say, a 20% of the cars, being EVs at all these little stations that are gathering 30 cents worth of electricity. Has that been part of your process at all?
So one, I will complain to the town, because I actually live in Winchester, so I'll complain about not charging for electricity. I mean, the reality is someone is paying for it, right? So all those charging stations are metered. So I'm assuming it's probably paid by the town. And probably what they've done is they've realized that the cost of, they've probably done the math of saying how many cars are we going to charge, what does that really mean, and how much do we have to pay kind of a credit card provider for making all those transactions, and you might end up paying more transaction fees than actually the energy itself. I think, so we haven't done a lot of that. I think we're not in that space of like really the transaction part of it. But what I would say is, I mean, those type of challenges are the challenges that we're going to start facing as this technology starts to deploy. And if you go back to my earlier comments, it's our financial challenges. They're not a technology challenge. It's actually a financial challenge on now people realize that, oh, by the way, making a credit card purchase every time you charge your card is pretty darn expensive. So do you add that to the cost of the electricity that you're delivering? So to me, those are the things that people have to figure out. We haven't done it. What we've done, at least from a utility perspective, is think about what are the right rates for those customers that do want to have charging stations, to make sure that they can benefit and maximize the value from the stations itself.
Along the same line, have you thought about the Israeli model where their batteries slide in, slide out the gas station?
Yeah.
So that you don't have charging stations, you just...
There's a company that is doing it. I think to me, for us, on my team at least, that's definitely still early on. We'll see how that plays out. We haven't, I mean, we've saw it on some scooters. A company has tried to do it on scooters, so I think I'm going to get the hook. So,
One more question.
solar developer. I need to get a question from you.
Just continue this fascinating. The CV question, it's kind of a fun one, is I thought about, you mentioned the Tesla. I know Elon Musk has just bought a solar company. It can't be far off when you go in and you say, oh, I like the Tesla, can I have it in blue? Sure, we can get it there next week. Would you like the solar system and the battery storage back with that?
Absolutely.
And what's the value? Based on your value, you're very good at value models. And you thought about the economic, this kind of competition?
Yeah, so to me, I think, so that will happen. I think it will happen, and it will happen soon, especially with that Solar City Tesla acquisition. I've talked to some of them, and that's definitely where they're going, right? They'll sell you the whole package. For us, rather than saying it's a negative thing, I actually think it's an opportunity, right? So they become an EV charger, an EV user, also a battery, that if you structure it right with Tesla, you can then use in demand response. You can use it during constrained situations. So it is actually a really good thing for us.
So it's a candidate for partnership model.
Exactly. So to me, I think part of what my team has been pushing overall, everyone within the utility, is we need to start being afraid that those folks are going to compete with us. The reality is, if you're smart about it, they can actually be helpful. So, I think I'm done. Good.